good evening, everyone, and just to acknowledge the traditional territory of the Tla'amin Nation and the unceded ancestral traditional lands of the Salish peoples, upon which we stand and have much responsibility for. Anyway, it's fun to be involved in all of this. In fact, it was a shock to me to realize who my father really was in going through all of the things that he had during his remarkable 67 years on this earth. And I was so, in retrospect, think that 67 is a very young age at which to shuffle off this mortal coil.
Yeah.
But that was the end of his time, and his good wife, my mother, lived on to be within 30 days of 100.
Oh my goodness.
So Stewart Alsgard is the last of the lot, having lost his sister just a few years ago, a couple of years ago. And after that, who knows? Whatever is left of all of this will be in the basement here, so if you need it to stomp on it or whatever you want to do, feel free to go down there. So just a quick history of where he came from. Dad was born in Alberta of a Norwegian father and English mother, and the English mother was the only English line in our family. The rest of us are all Scandinavian. And in tracing the name back to Norway, Martin Alsgard, that's Dad's father, left when he was 19 and came across to, I thought it was New York, and I stood corrected today, he landed in Boston. And in Boston he landed with the name Alsgaa with a umlaut over the A and the RD, to which the immigration officer told him there were too many letters in the name, and to be admitted it would be changed. Not would you, you shall change it. Hence I have a little sheet of paper showing like that, and there it is, Alsgard.
Wow.
Martin Alsgard made his way across the United States working in laboring jobs, Superior, Michigan, eventually coming to Alberta and settling because in the Granham area around Fort McLeod, south there. And I discovered to my great shock not too long ago that there are a great number of Alsgards buried in the once grain fields of Granham, Alberta, which no longer exists, I'm told. It became too small to be a community any longer, and it became part of Willow River, or Willow, whatever it was. So that's the history there. His bride, Lucy Alsgard, her name was Britain, oddly enough, having come from England. Came from Nottinghamshire, and I remember her very well as the grandmother that always took me fishing when we came to visit from Cranberry Lake to the village of Westview down on the dock. So how did all this really begin? Well, eventually Martin Alsgard gets to Kelowna, where he becomes the first fire chief of Kelowna. And when my sister was traveling for as a instructor nurse at that time, she was in Kelowna and at the old fire hall downtown. And the chief of the day said, "Oh, is this any relation of yours?" And there's a picture of my grandfather taken in 1920. You know, no uniform in those days, but the high white collar and the very severe looking black suits and all this sort of thing. That hall was now a museum, and the new hall is further out of town. There was a street named after him in Kelowna, and all of these little things I didn't know either. So Dad goes to school in Kelowna, and Kelowna High School, and comes down to Vancouver at 15 years of age on his own to stay with an aunt and go to the Vancouver Tech. And I found in all the belongings his sweater with the big T for Tech. Dad stood 6'4". He was a big man, so it didn't happen to me. My mother was the size of a water bottle, so I was averaged out as being economical and easy to afford and cost of. And he's quite an athlete. All of these things I didn't know. He played a lot of lacrosse, but I do remember as a small child being packed over to the Riverside Oval, where they had what was called box lacrosse in those days. And these great giants would run up and down this tiny little court with these, whatever they called them, and the elastic balls, and basically annihilating each other en route. And there would be the first contact really with the then Sliammon, because a lot of Sliammon, you know that lacrosse is very much part of the indigenous game playing, records back into the 17th century in this country. So at 17 years of age, he gets a job in the mill. And he ends up he starts out in the finishing room. And he works there for about 3-4 years, I guess, until eventually the theater, the Patricia Theater, is in an old building on the site of where the cenotaph is today, and it moves up the hill. Bobby Scanlon is responsible for that, and then MacLeod gets involved in it. And Dad had a fascination with anything to do with movies and so on, and desperately wanted to get a job there, and was desperately turned down every time he desperately went to the door. So there was no movie career for him. But in any case, somewhere along the line, something must have come to light, maybe in the finishing room or whatever it was. He got the bug to find a way to, he had a great gift to cartoon and draw. And you'll see a couple of illustrations here in this little presentation. That he met up with a fellow named Peter Mellier, and Pete Mellier and he became partners very briefly, and they go to Cranberry Lake, and at this stage my grandfather has a place called Alsgard's Hardware. It's at the corner of what you now call Crown Street, but its proper name is East Road, and the building, a third of the building still exists. King's Collision might help you with that. But just further on, and you'll see a photograph when I get to pressing all these buttons and things, of that building and what it looked like in those days. So Alsgard's Hardware begins life there. Dad is, of course, working in the mill and running up and helping his dad sell stoves and deliver refrigerators or whatever they were, setting them up. So he was going at light speed all of the time and just helping out. Then there's a fire and the building is partly destroyed. We get to my mother's side, they're all Scandinavians, and her dad is a carpenter. His name is Wick, W-I-C-K. Oh. He's another one of these that comes over from Norway as a young man with a young bride, and they settled in Saskatchewan and have 5 daughters and 1 son. One of those daughters was my mom. And only one of the daughters, 2 of the daughters, sorry, were born in Norway. Mother was not, but the other 2 were, and they were very close right till the end of their days. They're all gone now, of course, and anyway, the little place in Saskatchewan, is a typical little farm crossroads with a name or without a name. So this, of course, brings them all together. And how did Mom and Dad meet up? Because she's part of the chemistry at this point. The Mom goes to the normal school in Vancouver, you know, on Canby and 12th, I guess it is, which is now some sort of a, but the old normal school is encased inside this big building. And Gail was in there one time and she said, you know, when you go downtown, you got to go up and see, because you'll see Mom's picture in one of the graduating classes. Good. And sure enough, there, screwed to one of the railings in the place, is little Annie Wick, right there, who gets a job proposal here in Powell River. And 3 of them graduate at that time from they're all close friends, and they all hop on the Union steamship at that point, the Up Coast streetcar line, buy your ticket, get on, and let's go. And Steve Brindleson is, I don't know if that name means anything to you, is here's a brand new young teacher, teaching out at Lund, as a matter of fact, at that point, before he gets there. And then they had the superintendent, whose name, unfortunately, I could not find. However, the 3 young women are mustered and told, okay, there are 3 job opportunities in this community. I put the names in the hat, you draw your school from there. Mom pulls out her tab, stands there for a few minutes, doesn't say a thing, and the other 2 pull them out, and the other 2 pull out the following names. One pulls out Lund School. The next one pulls out Foch. You know where Foch was? Olson's Landing. Oh. That's Foch, named for the marshal, the French marshal, first World War. Yeah, so that's its original name. And Mom gets Westview Elementary School. Well, for over 40 years, they didn't speak to each other. You know, Mom is at Westview. There's Lund, And then up in the sticks is poor little Miss Black. And,
Oh, gee.
so there's a St. Patrick's Day dance in the 1927 newly opened White Hall. And Annie Wick and Al Alsgard meet. The rest is history. Okay?
Oh,
Weeks after that, they're married, and their first child unfortunately dies at the age of just over 1.
oh.
A sister whom I never, of course, knew, and then I was next, and Gail was the last of the lot.
Wow.
So we now go back to Cranberry Lake very quickly, where in order to find a place, we establish on Nelson Street. The house still exists, halfway down, heading toward Manson on the left-hand side. I have very vague recollections of that, but we moved around the corner to Church Street. And if you go down Church Street, there's a house, yellow house, high-gabled yellow house. That's the house. And that's the house where the town crier started up in the attic. This little mimeographed sheet here, like this, all hand-drawn by my dad, and distributed by the young Italian boys. There were only 2 non-Italian families living on Church Street in those days. One was Alsgard, and the other one was Standel across the road. And the rest were Culos, Acata, Pelosa, Giovanni, you name it, they're all there. So up in the attic of this place, there was a mimeograph machine that Dad has acquired from whatever means, and he decides that it's probably a good idea to publish little leaflets. Let's start with the Patricia Theater maybe, and get Myron McLeod to see if he wanted to buy this for $5, and they distribute it all around the household. And then let's try the grocers, Mr. Boza, Mr. Brown, and all the rest of them in Cranberry, and so it went.
Wow.
So from there, he thought, well, you know, maybe there's little things I could report. You know, people are interested in who's born, and who's married, and who's dead, and all this sort of thing. And so little things like this find their way in there. The man had a wonderful gift, just to write and to think about these things and appreciate the human condition. And so it started, and that's reflected in his later years in a column he loved so dearly called I'll Take Vanilla. And whatever the purpose of taking vanilla was in those days, I don't know, I still don't know. And I've been asked what did it really mean, and I tried to invent all sorts of things, and none of it has flown. So I'm still researching out how it was that he came to call it just that. So I'm going to press a button here at great risk to life and limb. Yeah, you pointed at this thing. Steady there, Dad. Hold on. Yeah. There, okay. So now we're moving into when the newspaper started. So Dad is here, but it's in 1927. Tommy Green, a name some of you may or may not have heard of, but Tommy Green had come to Powell River before that as a printer. And he was doing a lot of printing and so on for the Powell River Company, forms that they would need, and by trade he was a proper printer. And but he got started actually in Alberta. What Alberta had to do with all this, I don't know. But here's Tommy in a place called Tabor, Alberta.
Okay.
And he runs a little thing called the Tabor Times. And then he comes to Powell River, starts his print business. And then he starts the Powell River News in 1927. And at this point, Tommy Green is, the paper is quite well established, and probably he's, by 1932, Dad is into the business of the Powell River Town Crier, which I just showed you a moment ago. And then thinking in terms of where it might just go from there. 2,000 years of civilization, and then we come to this. Anyway, here he is, but this is a picture taken much later on, but he's by this time established in the Town Crier, and the Town Crier building exists to this day. It's right across from the Senior Center in Cranberry, or Cranberry Lake, the proper name of the village of Cranberry Lake, and the village of Wildwood Heights, okay? And the village of Westview, ex-Michigan Landing. So here he is, this old typewriter just in the days when he was getting going, and here he is later on by this picture, just to show you what he looked like, is taken in Westview, in what is today the Well, the old Powell News building, you know where that is,
Yeah,
whatever,
yeah.
there's what do they call that thing, a bus stop or something?
Base Cap Coffee Shop?
Thank you, that's, yeah, so that's the building this is taken in, which is, suffers much modification. So this is the machine that Tommy Green actually had when he started, got into his printing business and was working with his Powell River, with the Powell River News at that point. And this was a famous little press made in Germany called a Heidelberg, and it was a hot metal letterpress thing that had all sorts of vacuum facilities and could work miracles in producing forms. And this would, of course, lead to the next thing here, the next, good grief, 2,450 years of this. I'm sorry for this thing, but I'm not used to these things. So there he is, in high flight, getting on with working his Heidelberg press. And here, then, is the printing room that Tommy Green had in the Powell River News in 1927, 28, 29, in what was a very small building at the site of the present building that you see there. They all look the same, they just got bigger, that's all. So not to be outdone, of course, Dad is now in the business of the first town criers, and here they are, and these are a result of using a mimeograph, a wax stencil with the little etchers. That's all his handwork and so on, all his comment in there. And then, whoops, well, I was right, get back to where you were. Oh, fiddly-dee. Okay, we'll stop with that thing for a minute here, and, well, I'll tell you about that picture in a minute. Put that thing down for a second there. So these things are being collated and stapled. There's my mother and her sister, the youngest sister, Lillian, and they're up there, and the thing is coming off the mimeograph. It goes by, stamp it over like this, goes down the stairs into the arms of one of the Zacataro Kulos boys across the street, and they're off like grease lightning to places he's under everybody's doorstep or on them, or no matter what. So this now progresses into the town crier and gets going in grand style in Cranberry. And here is the first business license issued from the village of Cranberry Lake to one Al Alsgard for the business of printing and publishing.
Wow.
Fee, $5.
Woo.
$5, Saint Dollar, but not cheap, but anyway. And here is a quick picture. I'll show them to you. You can see them a little bit after, but that's the corner of Manson and Cranberry Lake Street. The building became, when Dad left it, became Cranberry Sheet Metal, and it went on from there. Dan Mobley bought it. And the Liebenschel family were across the road, and Bert Long was just getting going with City Transfer 1945 Limited in the coal business. And Dad's little shop was nowhere near the one that you saw a moment ago. It was an absolute shambles.
Wow.
But it worked anyway, and it didn't injure anyone severely, which was a good thing. And they were able to get the paper out on time, looking much smarter than the original mimeograph thing here. In addition to all of this, Dad, that's, just a minute here, stay calm, Stewart. There. Okay, we'll talk about this, but this comes a little bit later. This is when Dad also started down on the peninsula with the Coast News, which began, of all places, at Half Moon Bay.
Wow.
And with a man named Ernie Parr Pearsons. You may remember Mrs. Pearsons, Parr Pearsons, who worked for Gordy Turner in the old Powell River Television, and then went on from there and actually ended up living not too far from where my parents lived in their retirement years. And Ernie was down there setting up the Coast News, and that was being printed here in Powell River. And here in the airplane, Diotti Airways, this little CB aircraft on Powell Lake, is little Stewart Alsgard, age about 9 or something, whatever it is, being handed the Coast News, which they would then fly down to Half Moon Bay, and it would go off and be distributed and so on. It either went that way or it got loaded onto the Union steamships, for better or for worse, and whenever that thing did get to Half Moon Bay, the paper got to Half Moon Bay.
Right.
So we're moving on in the publication of all of this, and haha, gotcha. Before we get to this one, there's a bit of history to fill in, and that is Dad's really clicked with the whole idea of editing and publishing a weekly newspaper. And he's making quite a name for himself in terms of the standard the paper has. It is now competing with the Powell River News at this point. At this point, Tommy Green has sold to a man named Les Way, L.C. Way. And from about 1938 to 1945, they're fierce competitors, but remarkably, they're great friends. And they remained that way to the end of their days, with Dad buying Les Way out and Les Way going off to Vancouver to continue on in the media business and so on. So Dad decides it's time to move out of Cranberry Lake. Well, before that happened, do you remember Stan Plisson? Does that name mean anything?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, Stan started with Dad at age 14. And Stan used to play hooky from school. His mother didn't know what was going on, but Dad used to write notes to on behalf of Mrs. Plisson to the school saying, please excuse Stan today because he's not feeling well. Stan is down doing what he desperately wanted to do and did so well all his life, was to be involved in newspapering, but more on the production side of it. And he had all the skills of a natural linotypist, and he could make up the forms and the chases and so on. So when you get together, this team is beginning to come together at this stage. The names like Joe Wasilic and Tommy Odale and Joe Bieber and oh gosh, the other names will come flooding in when we see a few more of the pictures here. But I have to move it along for you so we don't get bogged down. And but we have Stan Plisson going over first thing in the morning to the Town Crier building in Cranberry. Or if it wasn't he, one of the other persons that was working there at that time, to light the stove to get a bit of heat. Half the building was a dirt floor, and the other half was whatever wood was around the place to put down on the dirt to make a floor. And that was the way that building was. Yours truly is 7 years old at this, was 1942, so you can figure it out. And is down skating on the lake with his little mates, and one of them announces to me, your dad's place is burning down. Stewart Alsgard runs away from the lake all the way up the hill to see the fire, which is now pretty much under control, still wearing his skates.
Oh.
And standing in the picture that I might be able to show you a little later, others that came up with their skates still hanging over their shoulders. You can imagine what my ankles would have looked like at that day. Fortunately, they were made of plastic, but probably are to this day.
Yeah.
So they had the fire, put that out, and at this point, things were getting to the stage where the amalgamation was going to come together, and the competition was such that not only were they doing well in town, and their circulations were probably just over 1,000, 1,200 each paper with its own constituency, but people were siding for different reasons with different papers, and then you had to split the advertising. You can imagine what went on. So each had to try to outdo the other, but it became impractical from a business point of view. And they sat down and said to themselves, look, let's consolidate this. What do you think we should do? One would sell to the other. And how that came to pass, I'll explain to you a little later on. But one of the persons who wrote for Dad's Town Crier was lived down in Moet Bay, and Cranberry was much different in those days. It was a very different place, and it's nice to see it coming back the way it is, and so many of the original buildings still there. And I love going there because I'll tour you around anytime you want, free of charge, of course. He attracted people to his paper because he opened his paper to those who wanted to make contributions or write columns, which the Powell River News was a little less likely to do. Do you remember the CCF, the Canadian Commonwealth Federation, the CCF party? And of course, in the Depression years, things were pretty hard and tough in Powell River. Make a long story short, the CCF was not well regarded. Indeed, it wasn't at all regarded by the Powell River Company. If you were seen at a meeting or belonged to or anything like that, you lost your job. You were out.
Wow.
That's the way it was, to put it quickly in a nutshell. And as the Depression is waning and the winds of war are starting to gather overseas, things are changing rapidly. Dad had one person came up and said, I read your article on, the big argument over pasteurizing milk in those days, and this fellow was very much in favor of seeing it pasteurized. And he was a Scot, and he said, I have an article here, would you publish it? And he did, and Dad liked it and said, well, would you keep writing articles? And he did do that. And he wrote articles that were very much in favor of the CCF party in those days. His name was Bob Strachan. And Bob Strachan became the official leader of the opposition and in Victoria during the Barrett government and Minister of Transportation. There's the article that's framed that appeared in the Vancouver Sun talking about Alsgard getting the leader of the opposition organized so that he could take his office in... So I am in Victoria as a naval officer, and we're all... I had to stay off the base because they had no room for some of us, so I was living in a little place right down on Quebec Street in down James Bay. And we looked right across over the hump of the CPR ships and to Vic West. Up on the top of that hill, just over the Johnson Street Bridge, was a lumber yard and a fuel storage yard at that point. There was a terrible explosion. I just come back in, I'm just changing out of uniform, and my apartment thing had a little balcony on it, and there was a kind of a little grill beside it, and I went out to see whether we were under attack, and maybe I should put the uniform back on and go back out there and go down properly, or just wait for the end to come. When a voice on the other side of the partition said to me, would you like a scotch? And I said, I would, thank you, before, if this is the end, let's go down properly. So this arm came around the partition like this with a glass of scotch, which I seized immediately, and nothing else was said for a moment. Another explosion. What's your name? And I said, well, my name is Stewart Alsgard. What? He said, my name is Bob Strachan. Al Alsgard is your dad, isn't he? And I said, yes, he is. Small world, eh? So that story came to pass through there. We get to the war, and things are really going on, and there's lots of... and this is the official document that was put out by the Government of Canada on press censorship. Very rare to find. This was the guideline of what they could and could not print during the years 39 to 45. Okay?
Wow.
And that's headed for the museum here, and with all the instructions in it. And then we get to the actual sale of the Powell Reviews, and here is the edition of the Powell Reviews, still owned by Les Way. And the pair of them are on the front, displaying the trophies that each of them have won. Dad was the accumulator of most of the trophies. In fact, we get to 1952 in a minute, and I'll show you just exactly what the accumulation of trophies was. But here's the picture of the pair of them, and you'll notice that the jackets they have on are identical, because I guess that was the only cloth available in those days that either one could afford. But they both look pretty good in their tweed jackets, and here they are, Les is signing over the Powell News to Dad. And this is the official changeover on my birthday, the 18th of August, 1945. So, not that that had anything to do with it, but it just happened at thing. So the great thing about both the Town Crier and the Powell News, Dad had a great affinity for getting out these specials. Here's the sinking of the Gulf Stream on Dinner Rock. And I can remember running through the streets of Cranberry with Kenny Longstaff, Bobby Hammerton, Bobby Lee, a whole bunch of them. Extra, 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 selling this, telling the people that this huge ship had sunk on Dinner Rock, taking within 1,000 people or something. You know what little boys are like when they get going with the story. And the truth was out when we got there. So, the trophies look something like this. Here the pair of them are. And this is Dad on his first winning streak with the Town Crier. He is the top weekly newspaper, regardless of circulation, in Canada.
Wow.
For community service and editorial composition.
Wow.
It's an incredible, I didn't realize the depth of this, but just to give you an idea, this is probably 1940, 1947, and there's this marvelous great picture here, taken in 1952. Look at the trophies.
Wow.
He had to go to Quebec to receive these, La Belle Provence, and there they are, and these trophies are all laid out in front here, and there's Dad, second from the whatever it is, right, and brought these back to Powell River, which, of course, those trophies have to be, you know, they're in perpetuity, so they must be turned over.
Right.
But for each one was a certificate, and I'll show you a picture, and I believe all those certificates exist to this day. It was called a Record Grand Slam by the Powell River News, and this is the Powell River Digester, and the story of all of this is here. And here are trophies that he displayed at that time with the then editor and one of the other, the advertising manager of the day. Dad put on they had a special dinner to recognize all of this, which came out as a silver anniversary dinner, recognizing the full extent, 1927, the tenure of the paper, not his ownership all of the time, but at this particular event, you know, nice menu with all of these description of the trophies and so on. All of this will come to you, so merciful heavens, thank you. And so we're getting us here to just follow through on the trophy collection. Are three wonderful pictures. You can look at them. And in these pictures are three people. Stan Plisson, looking like he's 19 years of age. Peter Richard Mossy, who was, none of you, very few would remember, but Peter Mossy left here in 1962 to go with the Southern News chain, where he then went to Medicine Hat, and he became Southern newspapers training editor for all of their major employees for all the Southern chain. So Peter Mossy got his start in Powell River, and there's Dad standing there. And there on the certificate on that wall are most of the certificates that represent the trophies that they had won. So I'm presenting these three photographs, each from a different perspective, to Stan's wife, Sheila, who is still with us. And I was able to find amongst all of the possessions, when Stan was at the linotype machine like this, someone had taken a beautiful picture of Stan's hands on the keys. It was entitled Metamorphosis, and it was signed on the back by the photographer of the day. And I found this picture, and just after Stan passed in February, everybody kind of settling down a little bit, and went over and gave it to Sheila. I don't need to tell you about the impact of that, but Sheila worked for years for Dad in the bindery at the Powell River News up there on here on Marine Avenue, and Lois Stevenson, and oh gosh, a couple of others. Their names will come in before long. I can see them there in the back, folding these papers by hand. You know, the press wasn't a roll-fed press in those days; it was sheet-fed. Joe Bieber would stand up on that big old press there, one sheet at a time, and 3,500 copies later, Joe Bieber would probably go home, walk out of that building, doing this all the way up the street till then at night, and man got up to go out, you know, do whatever. He'd be still doing this, so he adapted very well. But anyway, that's the way it was, sheet-fed press in those days. And it would be a little later on that the Powell River News would convert over to a roll-fed. Newsprint would come in the back door on the big rolls that you saw at the beginning of this to be fed. And that would bring about the era of 1960. Now, I wasn't here at that time. I was teaching in England during that year, and but the Dad was able to cobble together to a plan $150,000, and that converted that building to basically what you see it today. Put the big addition on the back end where the press rooms were, put in more linotypes, more hot metal facilities. We had the state-of-the-art stuff in there before the new thing would be coming in a few years' time called offset. And you know where that's offset destroyed the hot metal part, and it was a part of the closure of the weekly newspaper production methods as well. But during that time, they always had tours, and the schools loved having tours of the Powell River News. So every grade, I'm sure, in town went through there, and Dad periodically would go in and explain. We have dozens of pictures here of the different people who worked at the news at that time, and it's an historical record because most of those people that were there never left. They were there their entire working lives with Dad at the Powell River News. He had 14 full-time employees and at one stage, and I think when he finally, the great day came, was Stewart going to be in the newspaper business or not? And the answer to that is very simple. Stewart had salt in his blood and ran away to sea, much to the great shock of his father, I think. And so he didn't. But so Dad sold the newspaper. That's another story which we'll just touch on very briefly. But as we move on through this era, the highlight of all this is, of course, we get to the year 1965. And in 1965, there was a great crisis for the community because pulp, paper, and even the sawmills in those days were really at the height of things. Things were going, the mill was in full blast down here. I think there were, of the 11 paper machines, 1 and 2 had gone, 3 and 4 maybe just going down, but 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 and were running, and there was going to be a new machine because there was a demand for another machine. Number 11 would come along. And so by this time the Powell River Company has been sold into the Powell River, into McMillan Bloedel and Powell River Limited, incorporating the Foley family, which were the second owners of the Powell River Company, which began life as the Powell River Paper Company, which in its first 18 months of operation went bankrupt. And they quickly changed the name to the Powell River Company, and they were able then to get on with the rest of that, which is covered in another aspect of the history of the community. So we get to this momentous year, and the year is 1965, and J.V. Klein, John Valentine Klein, Justice of the Supreme Court of British Columbia, just retired, has now become the corporate chairman of the McMillan, Bloedel and Powell River Limited. There's a terrible upset with the Foley influence in there, and there's a letter of great separation, and which will come to you as part of the history of this, where the Foleys were out, and the Powell River was dropped, and it just became McMillan, Bloedel, Powell River at that point. Okay, there was McMillan, Bloedel, Alberti. There was McMillan, Bloedel, whatever, and so it evolved. So the competition was on for this new paper machine, number 11. Where was it going to go? Was it going to go to Alberti? Was it going to go onto the island? Or was it going to come to Powell River? Where was it going to go? It wasn't going to Campbell River because that was Crown Zellerbeck in those days. So they got going here. And then this picture that you can see, the key players of the day, the names come to me. This is the Member of Parliament for here. He was the Fisheries Minister, whose name was Jack Davis. I don't know if it means anything to you. Down here in this picture is very interesting. This smiling little individual on the left is a man named Bob Jolin, who is the president of the Powell River Chamber of Commerce, who ran something called Powell River Parts, which is in the building now owned by Mother Nature. That was the first, they built it. There's the Honorable J.V. Klein, and over here is the Reeve S.A.D. Pike. Back then when they called them Reeves before they became mayors, all right? And Mr. Pike was a very composed, very focused individual who was, I think, perfect for the time at that thing. And over here, of course, is just the moment the announcement is made. And what is that announcement? Well, everybody was kind of anticipating it would be a win for the machine, and it was announced that Powell River for $100 million would be getting number 11 paper machine. Now, where was all this taking place? In Dwight Hall. Where else would it take place? I can show you right the very spot where I was sitting. Not that I left any indelible mark on the deck as a result of what I heard, because the flooring has been replaced. But nonetheless, we're there. And Klein gets up and makes the announcement that the number 11 paper machine is coming here. But I have something else I want to announce tonight. We're changing our process of manufacture from pulp sulfite to something called kraft. And we have to have a mill to produce this. We're going to build this new mill. We're going to build it right here in Powell River. And we're going to spend $185 million or more on that. So we'll do the sums, and this was a lot of $1965 coming to Powell River. And that was the result of this famous headline. And here on the desk are the actual blocks that are now in the possession of the museum, carefully wrapped in plastic, of course. The WOW headline came from. And how did that headline get to be? Well, I have to tell you the truth. What happened was that after this announcement, the next morning, I by this time back working with my dad for a short while, and we're standing up on the second floor up there. It was Pete Mossy, myself, and some of the Stan Plisson. And everybody's sort of saying, we've got to get the paper out. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? Well, one of the jobs that I had at that time was to run around and sell printing, make calls on people and get them to get their envelopes printed or whatever it would be. And I loved to look through the drawers of all of these typefaces that they had. And there was one drawer that had all of this, these great big letters in it. And from that, they used to print signs that would say, for sale, for rent, for this, for that, whatever it may be. And I thought, what do you think?
Wow.
That's how it got there.
That was so
This thing went all over the place. You know, it's just part of the history. You see it, reference to it, whatever.
Wow.
During that era as well came the Peninsula Times. This was published out of Seashell, but it was all part of the Powell News organization. And the first one, actually there's volume 1, number 1 of the Seashell Peninsula Times, which when it was published, everybody on the peninsula said, why is it being called the Seashell Peninsula Times? There's Gibson's and there's Red Roofs and there's everybody else. So you couldn't put all the names on the heading, so they said, let's call it the Peninsula Times. That morphed into this. And how did that get down there? Well, that went down there in those days basically because we had a road at that time to get it down. But I don't know if you remember Ernie Savidant, the name Ernie Savidant. And Ernie worked after he had retired from the mill. He needed something to do. Mrs. Savidant wanted him out of the house, find something to do, Ernest. And he went straight to Dad and found something for him to do, which Ernie would drive the truck around, you know, with the papers in it to distribute to the carriers. And when the big press broke down of the Powell News, we had to go over to Port Alberni to get it printed and so on. And Ernie would hop on the little floundering duck there, what was it, the Comox Queen, remember that thing? Yeah. And Ernie went regardless. And nobody else would want to go, but Ernie went in this little blue truck and pick it up, bring it back, and we'd get it out. Other famous things that happened, by which time we have the Powell News, Powell Town Crier. The Town Crier would come out on a Monday and the Powell News might come out on a Wednesday or a Thursday. Dad for a while discontinued the name Powell and the Town Crier and then brought it back and kept it up over time so that we could keep that going. And this was the famous time when Her Majesty came to Powell River. And I don't know if you remember that. I wasn't here, but nonetheless I remember Britannia, the yacht, coming here.
Right.
The Navy was required to provide protection for the yacht Britannia, and some of our frigates and so on had to go up to Twin Islands where HM went and stayed after here the ship sailed. You maybe didn't know that, but that's where she went. And you couldn't get through Baker Pass, you couldn't get around anywhere around Twin Islands, you couldn't get through the Copeland Islands. We just plunked a destroyer or a frigate there and blocked it off, and that was the end of it. Nice way to travel, eh? Take your own Navy and just make your own roads and so on. So now we'll flip through this, but my turn has run out. So Stewart Alsgard is airborne and making a mess of it again, and oh, for heaven's sake. There we go, right. Okay, so we'll just scoot back. There's the original building there, and Alsgard's Hardware is where the third car is there. And then we get down here. Here's the actual Town Crier building just after the fire. Notice it's painted white, got Town Crier on it. This is Ernie Liebenschell's gas station over here. Home Gas is the agency. There's Buster Crabbe's Imperial 3-star station over there. There's the brand new Alsgard hardware store here, which by this time is now called Ahola. Tom Ahola and Sons. Mr. Ahola came down from Sontula and bought the business from my grandfather, who then went to Hope, British Columbia, and had the Lake of the Woods Motel there until the war came. And the war came and the Army took it over. So Grandpa stayed with there, and the war ended, he retired, came back to Powell River, wisely so. And you can see Wilshire's and Brown Brothers, the old four-square church, there's East Road up there and all of that. So what a thriving little community that was, and that's the infamous street up which I ran with my skates still on. Here is how the Powell News building looked, not the original, because you have to knock off that piece to the right-hand side of it. There's the, what Tommy Green would have been in at that time. Notice the Hudson Terraplane parked in the foreground. On the door is the sign, the town crier. Okay, Dad has taken this over, so this is actually 1945 here. And look at that, downtown not Granville Street, Marine Avenue. If you look along there, you can see the Powell News building, and look at the telephone poles that are standing there. And that was the big controversy in those days when BC Electric said, as they went to BC Hydro, and there was a lot of other conversion, you know, from private to public ownership, there would be a certain compensations paid for this. The community was offered underground wiring. We'll take all the poles down and put them underground if you want, but there is a catch. And the catch was, of course, you had to pay a certain amount of money. I think businesses $500 or whatever it may be. They had a vote on it, and they turned it down. So there was the lost opportunity. There's the Powell News building as it looks to this, pretty much like it does today. In the front is that lovely little thing that we call Peter Rabbit. And that was the first of 7 vehicles that the News owned in those days, all painted robin's egg blue. It was better, Dad thought, to let the employees drive them than use their own cars. When their wives and sweethearts, may they never meet, be allowed to go shopping and deliver the children unto whomever they so choose. But notice the sign up top, it says the Powell River News, and then on one side it says printers, and on the bottom it says cash registers and stationery and whatever it may be, because every weekly newspaper was in the stationery business. Why? Because they bought it for their own use. And people wanted a stapler, where do you go? Well, go to the paper, they'll sell you one of their staplers. And that's how something called Books and Stationery got going later on, and so on. And then the bottom board there used to read the circulation of the paper, which would go from 2,000, 2,500, 3,000, all this sort of thing. So that was the order. Now here is in 1954, there was a Progress edition published, the Progress of the Community of Powell River. The copies of that, I think, are held here, and in fact, I will say that all the copies, the hard copies of Powell News Town Crier and so on, are all here in the museum. Courtesy of Golden Stanley, bless his heart, who as my scoutmaster and as his little helper, loaded all those things in the back of his station wagon to deliver to the museum of the day. And the last load he took away, he backed through the freight doors of the Powell News, but that's a separate story. City transfer, packing these off in those days. Notice the phone number, a 4-digit phone number on the truck, okay? And everybody in town got a copy of the Progress edition. And then finally, this is after Dad has sold the paper moves out of the building on Marine and goes up to where Overweighty was up there where the hospital auxiliary is today. And it has changed its heading. Notice the new format on the window, the reverse side. Powell News Town Crier. It is owned by this time by a company called West Press, which is a company based in Winnipeg. And is that right? Yes. And then today it's now Glacier Publications, I think, of the order. Glacier Publications is a $200 million a year business or more, which owns what once were weekly newspapers throughout the country and many trade magazines and God knows what else. And also owns the Victoria Daily Colonist, Times Colonist. So the era of weekly newspapering is gone. It died in the 1970s, the late 70s, I would think. And why did it die? Well, offset would come along. These things called computers came along, did away with typewriters, and next step will be doing away with people, and that'll be an interesting thing. We're getting along there too quite well. So, who knows, but it was the end of an era. And that great generation of weekly newspaper publishers and editors from sea to sea, and before we had the other sea, it was just a wonderful history. There's a beautiful book called A History of the Weekly Newspapers of British Columbia, which you shall get. And and it's all there, every weekly, and there were, 800 of them in those days across the country. Every little community had something. But go back to the competitions and how they competed with each other. and they had the Canadian Weekly Newspaper Association, which was the national organization for all papers in the country, which that's how the trophy thing got going, and that's where the recognition for listening in Powell River came from. And there's Golden Stanley, bless his heart, you know, peel me another grape, and boys, when we would be out scouting in the bush, he would stop us and he'd say, look down, and we'd look down and he'd say, eat that. And small boys in those days did what they were told, they ate it, and they lived. And he, get this, was somebody, this is a product of the tough years, their family, not homesteaded, what's the word I wanted, preempted land up in the Gordon Pasha Lakes, up in that area. And Gordon was just a small child at that days, living there, and he gave me a copy of his little book, the original one, and all this sort of thing. So he very kindly made sure that he made his contribution to the history of Powell River by preserving it. But he went to University of British Columbia for 2 years. He had to drop out because there was no money to pay for the other 2 years. He was in chemistry, enrolled in the faculty of chemistry. Had quite a history. And there he is, here, just in your office actually. Still there, so don't forget to feed him. Just going through, you can see in the background copies of the paper, and Doug Mobley's going to speak to that in a few minutes, and that's the end of that carry-on, isn't it? Thank there. And I'm over time, having, and I apologize for that, Doug has got, you're about 2 hours, isn't it? And, there is no breakfast service, I'm sorry. We'll be thrown out of the building when the lights do go out. There is so much to tell. And I look back on my own life, and I think I was part of it, and yet I wasn't part of it. And, but I had this wonderful man, whom I could call my father, who did these things, and was beside me whenever I needed him, and gave me great encouragement to do the kinds of things that I guess in a way selfishly decided was going to be my role in life, and not the one that he had, I think, probably down deep hoped would have happened. But left a legacy, bless him, and that's it.